You know what's more ironic? Mercedes threw out to the group. How about this? Violet was murdered on the very date Luke Hollander was killed 20 years ago.
Whoa. Wait.
Nate's gaze drilled into Mercedes.
That's right, but so what? You're trying to connect the murders? That's crazy. It's been decades.
Rachel felt her insides begin to shred. She had to get out of here, fast. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I am going to report on it, of course. I've already got someone tracking down the lead investigator on Violet's case, Detective O'Meara. Kaylee. The shredding cut deeper. She let out her breath, refusing to think of Kaylee O'Meara and how her husband had fallen in love with his smart, red-headed partner. Water under the damned bridge. Chapter 11.
Blam! Blam! Blam, blam, blam!
Kaylee maintained her stance, protective glasses in place as she aimed and fired at the target, her shoulders jerking with each blast of her pistol, her jaw locked. She was wearing ear protectors that blocked out everything but the satisfaction of hitting her mark, the outline of a man's torso suspended at the far end of the shooting range. She'd managed to tune out the other shooters in the indoor shooting range and was totally focused on the target positioned near the far wall. Her shots were on target, 3 a little off-center, just where a man's heart would be hidden under protective ribs. She fired off several more rounds before she was satisfied that her aim was true. By the time she was finished, most of the tension had drained from her body, and she felt re-energized. It had been a long day, and she hadn't wanted to return to her apartment on a Friday night, alone. Camille, a friend she'd known since her freshman year at Washington State, had phoned to say some friends were getting together for drinks and appetizers at O'Callahan's. Kaylee was familiar with the Irish pub located on one of the piers. Still, she had declined. Why? Camille had demanded. Got something better planned? Have you seen the news? I'm working on a homicide. Yeah, and I have a shitty job and a shittier boss who wants me to work late, but I told him, forget it, it's the weekend. Let's have a few drinks, catch up, and unfreaking wind. You're not going to bring that dead woman back, you know. Dead is dead. That's not what I'm trying to do. Okay, fine. I don't think a couple of hours with friends will stop you from finding out what happened to her. Maybe. Maybe not. The first hours of any investigation were the most critical. Come on, Kay. She hadn't let Camille persuade her. Instead, she'd worked until after 8 and then had come to the indoor range to let off some steam and let the case sink in. But now, as she zipped her jacket and stepped outside, she noticed the fog rolling in from the ocean. She wondered if she should change her mind and see if she could connect with the group, friends from college, most married, some with children. But why the hell not? She could use a break. She'd spent hours going over interviews and evidence, feeling the clock ticking, the killer getting away. All the while, trying to push aside the impact of seeing Kate again. Big mistake. She'd called him because he'd lived in Edgewater most of his life. Also because he was one of the best detectives she'd ever worked with. And because you wanted to see him again, be honest, Kaylee. Angry with herself, she unlocked her Honda with her remote, slid inside, and started the car. Yeah, she admitted to herself as she drove off, then turned on the radio and cranked it loud. She had used the excuse of Violet Sperry's murder to contact Cade, to see him, to check her own reaction to him as well as see what his was to her. And she'd felt crappy about it. Not that she couldn't use his insight, but because her ulterior motives were a little underhanded and disingenuous. Not her favorite traits, she thought, cruising along 101, the shops brightly lining the main artery cutting through Astoria. She'd fallen for him 3 years earlier when they'd worked a case together here in Astoria. He'd been separated from his wife then, and the murder investigation had gone on for months. It had happened during those long nights of a stakeout, when they'd spent hours alone together, the night surrounding them as they'd sipped coffee in a car or in the apartment across the street, trying to catch a view through the windows of the suspect's house. That was when she'd fallen in love with him. It had been stupid. He'd been married. She'd known it. And though he'd admitted to being separated, he'd never once said he planned on divorce. She had fantasized, of course, even though she told herself now that she'd fought her attraction to him. Had she? Or was that just a lie she told herself to feel better about the whole doomed situation? Tonight, she would unwind for an hour or two. Tonight, she'd put Violet Sperry's homicide on the back burner, and she would definitely stop thinking about Cade Ryder, even though he was now indeed divorced. Had been for nearly a couple of years. Still off limits, she reminded herself as she drove under the ramp to the Astoria-Megler Bridge, the tall 4-mile span that linked Oregon to Washington at the mouth of the river. O'Callahan's was located on the riverfront, tucked between a restaurant and bookstore in what had once been a series of warehouses and was now one big mall, a hodgepodge of stores on 3 levels. She parked, locked the car, then dashed across the parking lot to the wide glass doors that were the main entrance. Inside, reclaimed wood floors gleamed beneath industrial lights suspended near the exposed air ducts. She made her way down a short flight of stairs to the Irish bar and stepped inside, where the lighting was dim and the conversation humming. Customers lined the bar, where 2 bartenders poured drinks, chatted, and laughed in front of tall mirrored shelving holding dozens of gleaming bottles. 2 flat-screen TVs were positioned overhead, a baseball game in progress. Kaylee spied Camille seated in an oversized booth in a rear corner. Wild, streaked curls framed her heart-shaped face. She was sipping from a small copper cup, her lips a glossy pink. With her were 3 men and 2 women, heads bent over their drinks. Kaylee took a step toward them, then stopped. Maybe this was a mistake. She could spend the next hours piecing together the case, follow up on... Oh, crap. One of the guys was Travis McVeigh, her ex, the man she'd dated before stupidly falling for Cade. Her heart sank. Damn you, Camille. A roar went up at the bar as one of the players cracked a line drive. Travis looked up, then over, his eyes finding Kaylee. The back of her throat went dry. They'd lived together 6 months, and she'd walked out on him, never really explaining. She hadn't had the heart to tell him she was in love with another man, in love with a married man, and a man who hadn't felt the same, not that she'd known it at the time. Camille, too, caught a glimpse of her and began waving frantically, motioning her over, chatting up her friends, all of whom looked in her direction. Decision made. Mercedes was glaring at Rachel again. I'm just saying it's a pretty major coincidence that these murders are on the same date. You're right. A coincidence, Nate said. An ugly one, but nothing more. Geez, Mercy. You're suspicious of the whole damned world. That's my job. Then your job sucks. He drained his glass as Riva reached the group. Britt was on the verge of tears again. She flung a glance at Riva. You got this? Yeah, good. Sniffling, Britt hurried into the dining area and scooped up her notes and tablet. Look, anything you all decide is fine with me. Her gaze found Riva's. Just let me know. Text me. What? No! Lila had followed her to the table. Britt, you can't leave, she said in a soothing voice. We need you. You don't. Riva and Billy D can handle it. Undeterred, Britt slid her phone into the pocket of her maternity jeans. She's right, we're okay, Billy D said. Britt tried to swallow back her tears. I really need to get back to Pete and the kids. But, Lila held up her hands. If you stay a few more minutes, I just can't, Britt said, pushing past Lila and hurrying into the foyer and out the front door. It closed with a definitive thud. I should go too, Rachel heard herself saying. No way, you just got here. Jaw set, her cheeks coloring, Lila tried to take charge. She stood in the archway to the foyer as if blocking everyone inside. Listen, we're all upset, I get that. Me too, God, yes. But we have to get through some of this work. Come on, let's just get to it and make it a short meeting so everyone can get back to their families, okay? Really, we don't have time to reschedule. As a realtor, she was used to dealing with arbitration and bringing two opposing sides together. We just need to get this done, right?
Shit, I guess,
Billy D said.
I don't know.
You do. Just a few more minutes and then we'll wrap it up for the night. Lila was insistent.
Yeah, I don't want to postpone,
Reva said as she and Billy D headed back to the far end of the dining room table.
Fine.
Mercedes threw a dark glance at Rachel. You're working on the last of the classmates we can't locate. You got some? Under her breath, Reva said,
She's such a bitch,
as she walked past to join Billy D at the dining room table again. But Rachel didn't know if she was talking about Lila or Mercedes, or possibly both. I heard that, Lila said. Rachel? Mercedes prodded as she took her seat on the couch again. Yes, I've got a few. Rachel pulled up a tufted ottoman, sat on it, and opened her laptop while Nate refilled his glass. I've got names, addresses, email, and phone numbers. Everything but social security numbers. A hacker's dream. Mercy arched an eyebrow but didn't comment. She was still pissed. Rachel looked down at her laptop and clicked onto the file. There are, let me see, still 9 MIA, but I think I'll be able to track most of them down. I've actually got information on them, but haven't received responses to the emails.
You texted?
Nate took his seat again and sipped from his glass. When I could. Lila asked, Is anyone definitely not coming? Did anyone respond and say that they just weren't going to make it? Rachel checked the files on her laptop. I've got about 6 who are definite no's at this point. Who? Lila demanded. It was her contention that everyone should attend. To start with, we've got 2 who are serving time. Larry Gorse is in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, and then there's LaVon Tinker. She's in Billings, Montana. For what? Lila asked.
Larry was in for aggravated assault. Almost killed a guy,
Nathan said.
I saw Larry's brother a few years back, and he gave me the word.
Almost killed a guy. Rachel felt herself go cold inside. She had killed someone. Her own brother. Everyone in this room had been there. It was on the news even though it happened in Washington, Mercy said. I ran a few lines about it in the past and present column, and LaVon tried to run over her cheating husband with their minivan, complete with car seats. Thankfully, the kids weren't with her, but it put him in the hospital and she ended up in prison.
Okay, cross Larry and LaVon out,
Nate said, then needled Lila.
Hope you didn't want them to head any of the subcommittees.
Lila rolled her eyes and they got down to business. Finally. As promised, the meeting wrapped up quickly. Within 45 minutes, Rachel was climbing the stairs to get the kids. She gave a quick rap with her knuckles on Lucas's bedroom door before pushing it open to find the dim space illuminated only by dueling computer screens. Eyes adjusting to the darkness, she spied Lucas and Dylan each wearing headgear complete with microphones and speakers. Lucas was seated in a rolling chair facing a large screen, while Dylan sat on the floor, his laptop balanced on his thigh, where he was obviously playing some interactive video game that included abandoned buildings, a military force, big guns, and lots of blood. Dylan's back was propped against the foot of the bed, on which, in the dim, eerie light, she saw Harper and some boy she didn't recognize. They hadn't heard her. They were locked in a tight embrace, lips parted and kissing wildly, one of his hands in her hair, their jean-clad legs entwined. What the hell's going on here? Rachel stepped into the room, knocking over a cup of half-drunk soda as she slapped on the light switch. Immediately, the room was illuminated. Mom! As if she'd received an electric shock, Harper jettisoned away from the boy, nearly a man by the looks of him. Her feet hit the floor, and she stood thankfully still in her clothes, blinking against the light. Her flushed face instantly turned ashen. "What are you doing here?" Rachel ignored her daughter, her focus laser-sharp on the unknown kid. Was he a kid? His beard shadow was pretty thick. "Who are you?"
"Xander."
He rolled off the bed on the near side, and Rachel tried not to notice the bulge in his jeans, evidence of his hard-on. At least he had the decency to look embarrassed and tried to hide his arousal with the hem of an oversized sweatshirt. Dear God. Rachel turned her glare to her daughter. "What is this, Harper?" Dylan turned his head, as if suddenly realizing there was more going on in the room than the war game he was playing. He pulled off his headgear and scrambled to his feet, all the while shooting worried glances at Rachel. "Mom," Harper said, her voice thin, her chin lifted defiantly. "This is Xander Vale. He's a friend of Lucas's and mine." "Good friends, obviously," Rachel said dryly. When Xander took a step forward and extended his hand, she took it for the briefest of seconds. What to do next? No parent manual for this one.
"Nice to meet you,"
he said, this near man in a gray U of O hoodie, torn jeans, and bare feet. Apparently, he was attempting and having some luck at growing a beard. A beard! His eyes were dark, and there was a hint of arrogance beneath the veneer of embarrassment. "I don't trust you," she thought. "Not 1 inch. What are you doing with my 17-year-old daughter?" "Get your things," she said to Harper, her voice tight.
"Back off,"
Lucas grumbled as Dylan nudged him with the toe of his running shoe.
"I hit you. You are done, man."
"Hey," Dylan said into his microphone.
"What?"
Lucas snapped, yanking off his helmet.
"What's your problem?"
Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught sight of Rachel and realized the lights were on and the jig was definitely up.
"Oh."
"Yeah. Oh," Rachel said, and for the first time caught a whiff of marijuana smoke. "Great." She motioned to both her kids. "Now," she said. "Downstairs. Move it. Your dad's on his way." "Dad!" Harper nearly squeaked out the word, and she glanced around the messy room frantically. "My stuff is in the car." "Get it." Rachel was in no mood for any kind of excuse. Eyes wide, Harper said softly, "You're not going to tell him about Xander?" Rachel asked. "Oh, yeah, you bet I am. Not only that, but you." She pointed at the man-boy and looked him straight in the eyes, despite the fact that he stood 6 or 7 inches above her. "You, Xander Vale, are going to meet him." Harper let out a little sound of protest. Her makeup was smeared and she appeared so damned young. In the ensuing silence, Rachel kept her eyes on Xander and was vaguely aware of sounds drifting up from downstairs. Music punctuated by voices floating up through the vents. With a tenuous grip on her emotions, she said, "Harper's dad is a great guy." Glancing at her daughter, who was frantically shaking her head, Rachel added, "I hope she didn't fail to mention him." She tried to maintain what little of her cool she still held on to. The boy, staring at the floor, plunged his hands into the front pocket of his sweatshirt and had the good sense not to try to argue or butt in. "Cade," she said. "That's Harper's dad's name. Detective Cade Ryder." She waited just a second, hoping to let that final bit of information sink in. The kid, to his credit, stood his ground. "As I said, he's a cop, and trust me, he's going to want to meet you." Chapter 12. Cade had barely closed the door of his truck when he saw his ex-wife and kids fly out of the front door of his father's house and gather on the porch. Another kid was with them as well. Not Lucas. Maybe older. In an Oregon sweatshirt, jeans, and flip-flops, the boy looked to be pushing 20 or 21. So, not a boy. Beside him, a white-faced Harper appeared positively apoplectic. Dylan was sullen and distant in his earbuds, and Rachel's expression told him she was pissed. Make that really pissed. Great. Another family trauma. How many had this old house witnessed? How many while he was growing up? Cade hated to think. "What's going on?" he asked as he mounted the familiar steps and felt a cool breeze ripple off the Columbia and blow inland. The door to the house was open, the foyer chandelier aglow, a patch of light silhouetting the group gathered just beyond the threshold. "This," she said, indicating the boy he didn't recognize, "is Xander Vale." She yanked the door shut, throwing the porch into semi-darkness, the only illumination cast by the interior lights through the transom, sidelights, and windows. "He and Harper were getting pretty friendly upstairs in Lucas's room." She shot the kid a hard glare. Vale stood his ground. Harper seemed to wither. Cade felt his muscles tense. Rachel was just gathering strength. "And though I can't prove it, I think there might have been some marijuana involved." It was the big kid's turn to blanch. "No," he said, and met Cade's gaze. "No weed." Marijuana would change things. In Oregon, it was still illegal for minors. "Seriously," Harper said, finding her voice, "we were not smoking." "But you and Xander were together." Cade glanced at his daughter. Harper crossed her arms over her chest and, with her chin set, met his gaze defiantly. Xander Vale said simply, "I like Harper." Cade nodded, glanced at his daughter. God, how did she get to be so grown up? "I like her too," he said, trying to remain calm. "It was going far beyond liking her," Rachel said sharply. "Mom," Harper said, mortified. "Harper, you were making out with this guy." She jabbed an accusing finger toward Vale. "With your brother and Lucas in the room and me just downstairs. So don't act like you're embarrassed now. For the love of God, what were you thinking?" "Mom, stop!" Harper yelled. "God, please, just stop!" The Vale kid winced in the half-light, and Harper looked like she wanted to sink through the floorboards right then and there. Cade didn't blame her, even though he wanted to throttle Vale right then and there. Instead, jaw tight, he stuck out his hand. "Cade Ryder." Vale hesitated, then shook his hand warily. Harper fought tears. Dylan moved his head to the beat of some song only he could hear through his earbuds, though Cade caught him sneaking glances at both of his parents and Xander Vale. Maybe his son wasn't as out of it as he let on. Cade hoped so. Vale said, "Look, Mr. Ryder." Rachel cut in, "Detective Ryder," and shot Cade a hard glare, silently reminding him to be the father here, and maybe a hard-nosed cop to boot, as if he'd forgotten his role. Not likely. Vale swallowed hard. Your wife, she did say you were, with the police." Cade nodded. "I am." "Ex-wife," Rachel clarified. Then to Harper, "Geez, didn't you tell him anything about you? How long have you been dating, or seeing each other, or whatever it is you call it?" Vale slid his glance to the side. "We..." Inching her chin up a fraction, her backbone ramrod stiff, her hair catching in a gust of wind, Harper said, "We met last week." "Last week?" Rachel's jaw dropped. "Holy..." "When?" "We were at a baseball game. Lucas brought him." Rachel shook her head. "This is ludicrous. You met him last week, and tonight you were... Oh, geez, honey, what were you thinking?" Cade doubted much thought had gone into the encounter. He remembered what it was like to be young, how hot one's blood could flow, how quickly emotions got out of hand, how he and Rachel hadn't been able to keep their hands from each other's bodies, how all they'd thought about was being together, alone. And what had happened? Barely a year out of high school, Rachel had gotten pregnant with the very daughter she was now trying to warn. "How old are you?" he asked Vale as a car turned the corner, a white sedan. Reminded of the Buick with Idaho plates he'd spied earlier, he watched, tensing, as the sedan drove past, engine purring, headlights washing beams over the street before heading downhill. An older Ford Taurus, Oregon license plate illuminated. Not the same vehicle. "Just turned 20, Vale was saying. I go to U of O down in Eugene. I was just up here hanging out with Lucas. We played ball together. I'm in pre-law. His old man, his dad, said I could work for him this summer full-time. I work there now, part-time." My old man, Cade thought. "Harper's 17, Rachel said in a low voice. For a second her eyes narrowed on Vale. Then she glanced at her ex as if he could solve this problem. Cade had been a few years older than Vale was now when he and Rachel had first gotten together. He'd been to college, served as a Marine, but he'd fallen for a teenaged girl. "Look, I think what Harper's mom is saying is that if you want to date our daughter, ask her out." "She wouldn't let me go," Harper spat, shooting her mother a hard glare. "Probably not," Rachel agreed. Cade held up his hands. "Let's just slow this train down, okay?" "Nothing happened, Dad," Harper cried. "Nothing. We just kissed." "Okay." Vale gave a quick nod. "She's right. Nothing happened." But his dark eyes smoldered, and Cade didn't trust the kid as far as he could throw him. "Let's just keep it that way, okay?" "Yeah." The kid gave a quick nod, while Harper, mortified, glared at her father. Dylan, embarrassed, on one foot then the other, caught his attention. "Can we just go?" "Yeah," Cade said. "You got your things?" "In Mom's car." "Transfer them. I'll be right there." Then, as Dylan hurried down the steps and bounced across the yard, Cade eyed Harper and Xander. "We all understand each other here." Harper nodded stiffly. Vale said, "I'm cool." "Good." Cade doubted it. He'd been in the throes of teenage lust. Cool wasn't a part of it. Worse yet, Harper was casting the kid a sly, adoring glance, as if Xander Vale were God's gift. Yeah, that was a problem. Cade said, "Okay, let's go then." Relieved, Vale lifted a hand in Harper's direction, turned, opened the door, and zipped into the house to take the stairs 2 at a time. Athletic, good-looking, slightly rebellious, older. Trouble. "This is not over," Rachel warned, and Cade didn't know if she was talking to Harper or him or both. He decided the statement was probably all-inclusive. "Can we just leave?" Harper whispered. "Yeah, okay." He glanced at his ex-wife, and she didn't argue. To Harper he said, "I'll meet you in the truck. I want to talk to Mom a sec." "Oh, great," Harper mumbled, rolling her eyes before heading to his pickup. "Deal with this," Rachel ordered, pointing at his chest. "I'm serious." "I know. I will." "Good." She started to follow after the kids, but he caught her by the arm and spun her back to face him. "What?" "We were that age once," he reminded her, and she looked at his fingers, clenched as they were on her wrist. "Exactly." Her gaze met his. "And I got pregnant." "And it wasn't the end of the world." He let go. "She's only 17. I was older. But let's not have her replay our mistakes, okay? She's got a whole future ahead of her." "You've talked to her?" he asked, What, about sex? What do you think? She shook her head, the auburn strands of her hair catching in the light cast through a nearby window. From the time she was in 6th grade. Of course. Have you?
Not really.
What about Dylan? She asked.
He's just
15, she shot back, her face in shadow. How often did you think about sex at his age?
Too often. All the time, in fact.
His face must have given him away. Yeah, I thought so. So, there you go, she said.
I will. I'll talk to him tonight.
Good. I've already brought it up. We had a discussion. He hated it, of course, but it had to happen. Face it, Cade. We don't just have to worry about our daughter, right? Dylan could be sexually active for all we know.
God, I hope not.
Me too, but... She let her voice trail off, and he stared at her profile. Narrow nose, big troubled eyes, dark lashes that brushed high cheekbones, and lips that were now pursed in thought.
Let's take it down a notch, okay? Not go all parent ballistic on them. Try to have a reasonable discussion.
One dark eyebrow raised. Is that what I'm doing? Going parent ballistic? He actually felt his lips twitch.
Well, I wouldn't say you were exactly the calm voice of reason.
She didn't seem amused by that. Okay, then that's your role, okay? You be the super dad who talks things out and keeps his cool. That's on you, but you might want to know that Dylan's in trouble at school.
What?
She told him about his son cutting class and trouble with an older kid who was bullying him over some bet not being paid.
I'll get to the bottom of it.
Good, do that. I'd prefer not to have Marlene Walsh on speed dial. When he didn't respond, she clarified, She's the vice principal.
Got it.
He paused, sensing there was something more, something she was holding back.
What?
She opened her mouth, hesitated, then said, I'm just upset. Everybody... She motioned toward the big house and the people inside. All of us knew Violet and... Well, it's a shock.
I know.
In the half-light, she appeared vulnerable. The girl he'd fallen in love with. Hurting. He thought about pulling her close, but knew she'd reject him. Thankfully, the door flew open. Everything okay out here? Lila asked, stepping outside. Just dandy, Rachel said, and for a second he thought she was going to let things lie. But that wasn't Rachel. She tilted her head and said, You could have told me. Lucas had a friend over. Lila shrugged. I did, when you first got here. Xander goes to school at Oregon, but practically lives here when he's not in Eugene. Uses the apartment Charles has for out-of-town clients. What's wrong? Nothing, Rachel shot back, then said, Unless you mean everything. And she swept into the house. Is she okay? Lila whispered to Cade.
Right as rain.
The lie was easy. He didn't want anyone, especially not stepmommy Dearest, to know anything private about his kids or his ex-wife. Besides, he had never trusted Lila. Not when she was pretending to be Rachel's good friend, and certainly not as his father's second wife. There was just something about her that made Cade wary.
We're all, unnerved, upset, freaked out, whatever you want to call it, about Violet.
Rachel returned and swept past them. If the kids need me, they'll call, he said. But his ex-wife, purse and laptop tucked under her arm, keys in hand, was already down the steps and hurrying across the damp grass to her Explorer. Lila's eyes narrowed, and she was about to ask him another question when he spied from the lights of the house Mercedes Pope beelining toward him. Hey! She called. I wanted to talk to you about the Violet Sperry homicide. That's what it is, right? A murder?
Yeah.
That much was out. There had already been a press conference.
Not my jurisdiction. You'll have to talk to someone at the sheriff's department.
Who? And don't tell me. The public information officer, I know that.
Then the officer in charge, Detective Kaylee O'Meara.
Chapter 13. Rachel was still fuming when she pulled into the carport and cut the engine. Her whole life seemed to be unraveling. She was divorced, out of a job, her son in trouble at school, her daughter rebelling with a boy she sensed was trouble. And then there was Violet. Dead. No, murdered. She looked through the windshield to the fence that separated this covered area from the backyard. Listening to the engine cool and tick in the darkness, she said a silent prayer for the girl who had been one of the witnesses at her trial, the myopic 18-year-old girl who had sworn there was another shot that night. And she'd been right. There had been tons of other guns going off, along with firecrackers and other fireworks. It had all been so stupid. But it couldn't be changed. "Move on," she said, and opened the Explorer's door, the cool of the evening fresh against her face. She used to love the darkness when twilight bled into night, but that was before her sleep was interrupted by night terrors. As she was walking into the house, her phone went off and she recognized her father's number on the screen. "Hey, Dad," she said, letting herself inside the back door, only to hear a rapid-fire click of toenails as Reno scrambled down the hall and into the kitchen.
"Hi."
He spoke in his usual low tone as she took the time to pat Reno's head, then led him outside. "I didn't hear that," she admitted, as she watched the dog streak into the backyard. "Just got home. Reunion meeting. Had to let Reno out." She flipped on the back porch switch, illuminating part of the yard while the rest remained in shadow. She dropped her bag on a kitchen chair.
"I was calling to say I'm sorry to hear about your friend, Violet."
She imagined him in his house, seated in his recliner facing the flat screen that dominated one wall. He'd put on weight since he'd retired and had quit shaving every day. More than that, he seemed to have lost his drive, his will to get up every morning and face the day. With the divorce and retirement, he seemed to have lost direction. "Thanks. It's sad. Beyond sad. Weird, you know, and there I was with a bunch of kids from the class. Well, I guess we're not kids now, and we all talked about Violet. No one can believe it."
"I know. It doesn't make any sense, but then what do I know?"
He hesitated, and she knew he hated not being a part of the investigation, no longer being a cop.
"They're not saying much on the news about what happened."
And then she heard it, that click of a beer tab being pulled.
"Just that it looks like foul play was involved. A homicide."
You know how the police work, how they don't say everything.
"They've already asked the public to come forward."
A pause, and she imagined him taking a long swallow from his can. Then,
"You'd think that someone might know something. Hell, everyone and his dog has a phone with a camera in it, and with all the security cams on buildings or for home protection and traffic cams, someone probably caught an image."
Edgewater isn't Chicago, Dad, or even Portland. Lots of people around here don't even lock their doors.
"Damned fools."
They think they can protect themselves.
"As I said, damned fools."
She slid her gaze to the backyard, watched the dog sniffing the bushes, trotting in and out of the light cast from the porch lamp.
"So, how are you holding up?"
he asked.
"Tough day."
"Yeah, I'm okay." Well, that was a little bit of a stretch, but no reason to worry her father. He had enough, and this day was hard on him, too, having been the first officer on the scene to find that his daughter had shot her half-brother. She still remembered him whispering into her hair, "We'll get through this, honey, don't you worry," as he'd helped her into the back of the police cruiser. Although he'd been shell-shocked, he had taken charge. But things had never been the same. Never. How could they be?
Well, I just called to say I was thinking about you.
Thanks, Dad.
See you later.
And he clicked off, leaving her standing in the middle of her kitchen, staring out the window, phone in hand. The night of Luke's death had been the beginning of the end for so many things, including her parents' marriage. So you not only killed your brother, you ruined your parents' marriage. Stop, she said aloud. Besides, that wasn't quite right. Rachel had sensed there was trouble between her mother and father before that night, an unnamed tension that she couldn't quite put her finger on, but it had been present in the sharp glances, long silences, and tight lips. Looking into the darkened backyard, she watched the shadow of the dog as he sniffed around the fence, ferns, and furs before he came barreling back to the porch and whined to be let in. About time. She opened the door and he shot inside. She poured herself a glass of wine and savored the first sip of the Merlot. What was it about her? She wouldn't drink with friends, but once she was alone. But then, were her classmates really friends? Not for 20 years. She wondered about Harper and Xander Vale. How far would they have gone had she not interrupted them? Surely they'd have put on the stops with the others in the room. But Dylan and Lucas had been wrapped up in their game. And that brought her to her son. Trouble at school. Then there was the Xanax, missing tablets or not. Was that the real reason Dylan had been in the altercation? Did it have to do with drugs? She'd been certain she'd smelled marijuana. "Don't do this," she said aloud, and took a gulp from her glass. The kids were with Cade now, their father. She hoped to hell that Cade would talk to Harper and get through to her. Yeah, right. What were the chances of that? And as for Dylan, God only knew. Cade could handle him for the weekend. Tonight, though, she had another project. It was simple. Check out Xander frickin' Vale. Another long sip, then she topped off her glass, grabbed her laptop, and, with Reno at her heels, headed upstairs. In her bedroom, she stripped off her clothes, tossed them into an overflowing laundry basket, then slipped into a pair of comfy PJs. As the dog curled onto his bed, she headed across the landing to her office, which was located on the other side of the staircase. Like her bedroom, the office was tucked under the eaves, an attic conversion complete with built-in file cabinets, bookcase, and a long desk-height counter stretching beneath the single window. She set up her laptop next to her much larger desktop. She was good with technology and had honed her skills at finding out about people. She'd done work in HR at her last job along with bookkeeping. And then there was her side business, which, if things didn't improve on the employment front, she'd have to expand. So how hard could it be to find out some details about Vale? She cringed inwardly, but